Denzel Washington is one of the greatest names ever to appear in the history of American cinema. Over more than 40 years of career, he has built a legacy that very few actors can touch. Two-time Oscar winner, first for the deeply emotional role in Glory, and second for the cold, ruthless yet captivating performance in Training Day. Denzel Washington has proven himself one of the finest artists of his era. His roles in films like Malcolm X, Remember the Titans, American Gangster, or Fences not only brought box office success but also shaped the way Hollywood tells stories about power, justice, and human dignity. He has received more Oscar nominations than any black actor in history, won 3 Golden Globes, a Tony Award for Broadway theater, and in 2016 was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the highest honors in the United States. In the eyes of Hollywood, Denzel Washington is the standard of excellence. An actor who can silence an entire theater with just a glance. A storyteller who can turn on-screen characters into cultural icons. But behind those glittering awards and prolonged applause is another story far less glamorous and much more painful. Before becoming a legend, Denzel Washington was a boy who grew up amid the breakdown of his family when his parents divorced at age 14. He has admitted that if his mother hadn't sent him to military school, his life might have ended like many of his childhood friends, those who later went to prison or died young. His path to Hollywood was not a fairy tale, but a long series of doubts, failures, and pressures. Even after becoming famous, he still had to battle the temptations of fame and the loneliness of the spotlight. There were nights when the audience had left the theater, and the city fell silent, when the man the whole world called an icon still had to face himself with questions about faith, responsibility, and the price paid for success. And perhaps it was in those quiet moments that Denzel Washington's will was forged, not to become the biggest star in Hollywood, but to become a human being strong enough to survive every challenge life threw at him. If the story of Denzel Washington's painful yet extraordinary journey makes you think, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the real stories behind Hollywood legends. Denzel Washington was born on December 28, 1954, in Mount Vernon, New York, a small town just north of New York City. For many people, Mount Vernon is just an ordinary name on the map, but for the boy who would later become Denzel Washington, it was the starting point of a turbulent story. His father, Denzel Hayes Washington Sr., was a Pentecostal minister, a man who believed discipline and faith were the foundation of a righteous life. His mother, Lennis Washington, ran a small hair salon and was the strong woman who spent her entire life keeping the family afloat through hardships. In their home, the Bible was read every day, prayers rang out every evening, and young Denzel was taught that life must be lived with responsibility and dignity. But stepping outside that door, the world was completely different. Mount Vernon in the 1960s was not a gentle place. The streets where Denzel grew up frequently witnessed violence, crime, and drugs creeping into every corner. Arguments, police sirens, and stories of young men getting arrested were not rare. For a boy growing up, the line between the right path and the wrong one was sometimes separated by just a few friends, a few decisions, and a few moments of weakness. In his early years, family was the only thing that gave Denzel a sense of stability. But that stability didn't last forever. When Denzel turned 14, an event occurred that completely changed his life. His parents divorced. To adults, it might just be the end of a marriage, but to a boy searching for his place in the world, it was the collapse of an entire universe. The home, once filled with prayers and rules of discipline, suddenly became divided. The father he once looked up to as a symbol of authority and morality no longer lived with the family. And in that void, anger began to sprout in young Denzel's heart. He later admitted that period was one of the most dangerous phases of his life. The boy who had once been obedient in church began to rebel. The anger left him directionless, and the outside world with its tempting streets seemed to pull him far from the path his parents had hoped for. Many of Denzel's childhood friends were facing similar choices. Some of them chose the wrong path. Years later, looking back, Denzel said that many of the friends he played with never lived long enough to reach adulthood. Some were shot dead in senseless street conflicts. Some vanished behind prison doors. Some simply slipped out of society, swallowed by the spiral of drugs and crime. The familiar faces of childhood gradually disappeared from his life, one by one, and in that grim atmosphere, young Denzel Washington stood at the crossroads of fate, unaware that just one small decision, just one wrong step, could end his life the same way as many of his friends. But what the boy back then didn't yet understand was that sometimes, in the moments that seem most hopeless in life, a hand still quietly pulls us back from the edge. And for Denzel Washington, that hand was his mother. After the days of family breakdown, the boy once raised in discipline and faith began to drift away from the path his parents had hoped for. When his father left home, the void he left wasn't just the absence of a father, but the collapse of the order Denzel had once known. In his early teenage years, Denzel Washington began to change. He became hot-tempered, quick to anger, and ready to get into fights over the smallest reasons. Teachers' reminders gradually turned into arguments. Classes he once tried to keep up with now felt confining and suffocating. Denzel started spending more time on the streets around the neighborhood, where older youths gathered, where laughter mixed with recklessness, and where the line between mischief and crime was sometimes very thin. His new friends weren't always the ones bringing good things. Some of them were already used to running from the police, used to fighting on the streets, used to the feeling that life didn't offer many choices. And in that world, Denzel, a boy carrying the pain of a broken family, began to get swept along. But there was one person quietly observing it all. His mother, Lennis Washington, saw the signs that no mother ever wants to see. She saw the change in her son's eyes. She heard the stories about fights at school. She knew the friends he was hanging around with. And deep down, she began to fear something terrifying, that one day she might open the morning newspaper and see her son's name in a crime report. That wasn't an imagined fear. In the neighborhood where they lived, it had already happened to many other families. Boys who once ran and played on the same streets, who once shot hoops on the same school court, later appeared in the papers as names arrested or victims of street violence. Lennis Washington understood that if she didn't do something right away, her son could become one of them. So she made a decision that Denzel later called the toughest, but also the one that saved his life. She sent him to a military boarding school, Oakland Military Academy. For a rebellious teenager, that decision felt like being thrown into a completely alien world. No more free streets, no more hanging out with friends. There was only discipline. Every morning began before sunrise. The wake-up bell rang when most people outside were still asleep. Cadets had to get up immediately, fold their bedding neatly, put on their uniforms properly, and be ready for a long day of training and study. Physical drills took place in the biting cold of early morning. Orders were given short and sharp, and there, no one cared who you were, where you came from, or how important you once thought you were. Only one thing was accepted: discipline. At first, Denzel hated it all. He felt imprisoned in a world that was too strict. But as the days passed, something strange began to happen. The teenager, once full of anger, started learning to control himself. The drills taught him patience. The strict rules taught him responsibility. And, for the first time in years, he began to feel that his life could head in a different direction. Many years later, looking back on that time, Denzel Washington said a line he has repeated many times in interviews as a reminder of the thin line between fate and choice. That school saved my life. And perhaps he was right, because without his mother's painful decision that day, the boy who once stood on the edge of the wrong path might have become a very different story, one the world would never have known. The years at Oakland Military Academy eventually came to an end, and the teenager who once stood on the brink of the wrong path finally walked out the school gates with a new chance at life. But, even though discipline had saved his youth, Denzel Washington still didn't truly know who he was or who he wanted to become. After graduating high school, he went on to Fordham University in the Bronx, New York. It was an intellectual environment where young students talked about the future with confidence, where many already knew they wanted to become lawyers, doctors, or leaders. But Denzel Washington wasn't one of them. When he stepped through the university gates, he carried a big question he couldn't answer himself. Where was he going in life? His early years at Fordham weren't the story of a young man full of ambition. On the contrary, it was the story of a young person searching for himself in confusion. He changed majors multiple times, trying different paths in hopes of finding something that would truly stir his heart. For a while, he studied journalism, thinking that perhaps telling stories about the world could give meaning to his life. But the more he studied, the more he felt he didn't belong there. Then he switched to political science, trying to imagine a future in the world of power and leadership. But the lectures and thick books didn't make him feel he was on the right track. Later on, he tried economics, hoping that this practical path might bring stability. But all those choices shared the same ending: emptiness. Denzel later admitted that during those years, he was like someone walking through fog. Every step carried the hope that the path ahead would become clearer. But the fog never lifted. He looked around and saw his friends moving forward with certainty, while he felt stuck at the crossroads of life. And what worried him most wasn't that he hadn't succeeded yet, but the feeling that he wasn't truly living for anything. But sometimes fate doesn't come from grand plans, but from very small moments. One summer during college, Denzel took a job at a summer camp for students. There, besides the regular activities, there was a small theater program where students were encouraged to try acting. For Denzel, it was just a random experience, a way to pass time during the long summer days. He didn't think it had any special meaning, but during one rehearsal, when he stood on stage and read a few lines, a teacher stopped and looked at him for a long time. The teacher didn't say much, just one simple sentence, but one Denzel remembered for the rest of his life. She looked at him and said, "You have something." It wasn't flowery praise. It wasn't a long speech, just a short statement, but it was like a ray of light piercing through the fog in the young man's mind. For the first time in years, Denzel felt someone saw something in him, something he himself hadn't even noticed. That moment, seemingly so small, became the turning point of his entire life, because from that day on, thoughts of the stage began to stay in his mind. And for the first time, Denzel Washington began to ask himself an entirely new question. What if acting wasn't just an experiment, but the path that fate was waiting for him to step onto? The moment the teacher at the summer camp told him, "You have something," initially felt like just a passing comment, but for Denzel Washington, it was like a small seed planted in his mind. In the days that followed, thoughts of the stage never left him. For the first time in years, he felt something calling to him, not with certainty but with a very strange feeling, as if a door had just cracked open in his life that he had never noticed before. Denzel began spending more time on acting at Fordham University. At first, it was just small roles in student plays, late-night rehearsals in simple practice rooms. But every time he stepped onto the stage, he felt something he had never felt before. There, he was no longer the lost young man trying to find answers for his life. On stage, he could become anyone: a soldier, a father, a person fighting against fate. And strangely enough, each of those characters helped him understand a little more about himself. For the first time, Denzel felt he belonged somewhere. Not in the lecture halls where he had tried to study journalism or political science. Not in the thick economics books he had read without any interest. But on stage, where the lights shone down and every emotion became so real, it could not be escaped. The stage gradually became more than just a hobby for Denzel. It became the place where he could turn the pains of his life into art, memories of a broken family, the anger of youth, the years of feeling lost and not knowing where he belonged. All those emotions suddenly found a new language. When he acted, he didn't just read lines. He brought his entire life into every word, every glance. His classmates began to notice that there was something different about this guy. He wasn't the loudest, nor the one seeking attention, but when he stood on stage, he had a strange magnetism that made people unable to look away. That was why Denzel's next decision was no longer an experiment. He fully switched to studying drama, accepting a path even he didn't know where it would lead. After graduating, Denzel decided to pursue acting more seriously. He was accepted into the training program at the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, one of the most prestigious acting schools in the country. For many art students, just setting foot there was a dream. But for Denzel, it felt like stepping into a new challenge. The days there were not easy at all. He had to train constantly, learning to control his voice, body movements, emotions, and the rhythm of every line. Rehearsals stretched for hours. Critiques from teachers were sometimes so blunt they discouraged many students. But Denzel didn't give up. He had once stood on the edge of life as a teenager, and he knew the second chance he had been given was not something to waste. Even so, even after stepping onto the artistic path, his future remained completely uncertain. The late 1970s were not an easy time for a young actor, especially a black actor trying to find a place in the American film and theater industry. There was no promise he would succeed. No one said he would become a star. In reality, many talented actors had gone through classes like that and then vanished from the spotlight, swallowed by the harshness of the profession. Denzel knew that. He knew the path he was on could end in failure. But for the first time in his life, the fear of failure no longer mattered as much as the feeling that he was finally heading in the right direction. The days at the American Conservatory Theater helped him understand that acting wasn't about pretending to be someone else. It was about digging deep into yourself, finding truth in every emotion, and bringing that truth to the audience. Every role, no matter how small, was an opportunity to learn. And step by step, the lost young man from Fordham began to become an artist. But even then, Denzel Washington still didn't know that the road ahead would be filled with even more darkness, because entering the world of acting was only the beginning. To survive in that world, especially in Hollywood of the 1980s, he would have to fight much bigger barriers than any role on stage. After years of dedicated study at the American Conservatory Theater, Denzel Washington stepped into the professional acting world with a simple belief that talent and effort would eventually open the way forward. But Hollywood of the late 1970s and early 1980s was not a place that welcomed dreams easily. Especially for a young black actor, the door into the film industry seemed always only slightly ajar. Enough to glimpse the light inside, but rarely wide enough to truly step through. Denzel began auditioning. Day after day, he walked into small rooms where producers and directors sat behind desks, flipping through a few script pages and observing him for a few brief minutes. He delivered lines, trying to bring everything he had learned into every word, every look. But most auditions ended the same way. The people on the other side of the table smiled politely and said the familiar line, "Any young actor has heard, we'll call you." But the phone rarely rang. The waiting days stretched on, and gradually, Denzel began to understand that the problem wasn't just talent. In that era, major roles for black actors in Hollywood were extremely rare. The stories told on screen often had no place for faces like his, unless they were tiny supporting roles or stereotypical characters. There were evenings when Denzel left audition rooms and walked for a long time on the crowded streets of New York or Los Angeles, wondering if he was chasing a dream too far out of reach. He had left behind the stable paths of other fields to pursue art, but art promised no security at all. There were days he took small roles on stage or in little-known television projects just to keep working in the profession. And yet, he never gave up, because every time he stepped onto a stage, every time he stood in front of a camera, he remembered the feeling from the first time he discovered acting, the feeling that he belonged there. Finally, after years of patience and disappointment, the first big opportunity arrived. In 1982, Denzel Washington was cast in NBC's hit series Saint Elsewhere. In the show, he played young Dr. Philip Chandler, an intelligent, idealistic character who also faced the harsh realities of a tough hospital environment. For a young actor trying to find his footing, this was a major step forward. For the first time, audiences across America began seeing his face on the small screen every week. The series ran for several seasons and became one of the most critically acclaimed shows of its time. Many actors who later became big stars had appeared in the show, and Denzel Washington was part of that ensemble. But even with a steady television role, Hollywood still wasn't ready to call him a star. In the eyes of many film producers, he was still just a television actor, a familiar face, but not yet strong enough to lead major movies. Important film roles continued to pass him by, and sometimes the feeling of being overlooked hurt more than outright rejections. Denzel knew he could do much more. He felt the power of the stories he wanted to tell, the characters he could bring to life. But Hollywood still hesitated. Those years taught him a lesson he would repeat many times later. Success rarely comes right away, and sometimes the hardest thing isn't failure, but the patience while waiting for the real opportunity. Denzel Washington kept working, kept learning, kept stepping in front of the camera with the same seriousness he had once brought to his acting classes. He didn't know when the real door would open, but deep down, he believed that if he kept moving forward, one day there would be a role strong enough to make all of Hollywood look at him in a different way. And when that moment came, it wouldn't just change his career, it would change the way the world perceived Denzel Washington's talent. Those years of patiently waiting in the shadows of Hollywood finally led Denzel Washington to the moment that many later called the turning point of his entire career. That was when he took the role in the historical war film Glory, a story about the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, the first all-black volunteer unit of the Union Army in the American Civil War. In that film, Denzel played Trip, a runaway former slave, a man carrying the pain of an entire oppressive system. Trip wasn't a likable or easily approachable character. He was angry, stubborn, and seemed to always carry a layer of defense against the world. But within that roughness lay a profound truth about people who had been stripped of freedom for generations. Denzel didn't approach this role like just another job. He brought his entire life experience into the character. Memories of an angry youth, of feeling undervalued, of the pain of people pushed to society's margins. All of it seemed to blend into Trip, and when the cameras started rolling, Denzel Washington wasn't just acting. He was living inside that character. The moment that made all of Hollywood take notice came in a scene that seemed very simple. In the film, Trip is tied to a post and whipped for deserting his position. When his shirt is torn open, crisscrossing scars on his back are revealed, the marks of brutal years in slavery. The camera moves closer. Trip's face doesn't scream. He doesn't beg. He tries to hold a stoic expression, as if he's too familiar with pain. But then, in one brief moment, his eyes begin to well up. A single tear silently rolls down his cheek. No dialogue, no tragic music, just silence in the eyes of a man carrying the entire painful history of his people. That shot lasted only a few seconds, but when the film was released, it stunned audiences and critics alike. Not because of the drama, but because of its raw, painful authenticity. Many critics later said that in just one look and one tear, Denzel Washington had told an entire story of human suffering. Hollywood, which had once hesitated to give him big opportunities, suddenly could no longer ignore his talent. In 1990, at the Academy Awards, Denzel Washington's name was called for Best Supporting Actor. It was the most prestigious film award in the world, and for an actor who had stood outside Hollywood's door for so many years, that moment felt like a dream coming true. When he stepped onto the stage to accept the golden statue, he wasn't just representing himself. He represented a generation of black actors fighting to prove their talent deserved recognition. The entire room stood and applauded. And for the first time, Hollywood truly had to acknowledge that Denzel Washington wasn't just a television actor, he was a major artist. But glory rarely comes without new burdens. After the Oscar win, every eye began following his every move. From an actor struggling for opportunities, Denzel suddenly became the one the entire industry expected to keep proving his talent. Every subsequent role carried the question, could he repeat that miracle? Was this victory just a lucky moment, or a sign of a great career taking shape? For Denzel Washington, that pressure was no small thing. He knew Hollywood could be quick to lift someone up, but also quick to turn its back. One wrong role, one failed film, and everything he had just achieved could vanish. So instead of basking in the glamour of victory, he returned to work with the same discipline that had saved his life back in his teenage years. But even he didn't yet know that the biggest challenge of his career still lay ahead, a role that would test not only his talent, but also his courage in facing history. And that role was named Malcolm X. The Oscar win for Glory propelled Denzel Washington into an entirely new position in Hollywood. But along with that recognition came a challenge far greater than any role he had ever taken on. A few years later, a film project began to be talked about with both excitement and anxiety across the American film industry. The movie Malcolm X. This wasn't just an ordinary biopic. It was the story of Malcolm X, one of the most controversial, powerful, and profoundly influential figures in the history of the American civil rights movement. Malcolm X wasn't just a person. He was a symbol of struggle, of black pride, and of deep debates about power, religion, and freedom. So bringing his story to the big screen was an enormous responsibility. And when director Spike Lee decided to cast Denzel Washington in that role, many immediately understood that this would be one of the most dangerous roles in his career. If it failed, the film could destroy everything he had just built. Not just because of the stature of the character Malcolm X, but also because of the sensitivity of the story. Pressure came from every direction. From the African American community, who regarded Malcolm X as a sacred icon of history. From film critics ready to dissect every tiniest detail of the movie, and from history itself, because any inaccuracy in portraying Malcolm X could spark a major controversy. Many people openly doubted that any actor could truly capture Malcolm X's stature. Some critics said the role was simply impossible to play. Others even argued that attempting to bring Malcolm X to the screen was a mistake from the start. Denzel Washington understood that very well. He knew this wasn't a role he could approach like any other character, so he began a preparation process that many later described as almost obsessive. For nearly a year, he spent most of his time researching Malcolm X's life. He read Malcolm's biographies, studied his speeches, watched archival footage, and listened to every audio recording to learn how Malcolm spoke, how he moved, how he looked at crowds when addressing them. But Denzel didn't just learn the surface details. He tried to understand the man behind the icon. He explored Malcolm Little's difficult childhood, the years in prison that transformed him into a completely different person, and the spiritual journey that took him from an extremist activist to a leader with a broader vision before he was assassinated in 1965. This preparation process sometimes made Denzel feel like he was carrying an entire history on his shoulders. He once said that when stepping into the role of Malcolm X, he wasn't just playing a character. He was representing a part of American history. The people around him also felt that pressure. On set, everyone understood that this film had to be done perfectly, because a mistake wasn't just an artistic mistake. It was a mistake against history and the memory of millions of people. But when the film was completed and released in 1992, what many feared did not happen. Instead of destroying Denzel Washington's career, the role of Malcolm X lifted him to an entirely new height. From the very first minutes of the film, audiences could sense that this wasn't just an acting performance. Denzel didn't simply play Malcolm X. He seemed to become Malcolm X, from the way he spoke with that distinctive rhythm to the sharp gaze when standing before crowds. Every detail made audiences forget they were watching a movie. Many people, after seeing the film, said there were moments when they felt like they were truly seeing Malcolm X come back to life on screen. Critics also unanimously praised his performance. Many called it one of the greatest roles in American film history. The movie received numerous major nominations, and Denzel Washington was nominated for an Oscar for Best Actor. Though he didn't ultimately win that year, many still believe his performance in Malcolm X deserved the Golden Statue. But perhaps more important than any award was that Denzel had proven he could carry the biggest stories in history on his shoulders. After Malcolm X, no one doubted his place in American cinema anymore. Denzel Washington wasn't just a talented actor. He was an artist capable of bringing the most complex stories from history to audiences with rare authenticity and power. However, that success also brought a paradox. The greater he became, the more harshly his life was placed under the spotlight of fame. And in the world of Hollywood, that light doesn't always just illuminate glory. It also exposes dark corners that few can see. Because after becoming an icon, Denzel Washington soon realized that fame, the thing millions dream of, can sometimes become an invisible prison. After the resounding success of Malcolm X, Denzel Washington's life entered a completely different phase. He was no longer an actor searching for opportunities. He became an icon. In the eyes of Hollywood, Denzel Washington was now the face of authority, intelligence, and power on screen. Producers began seeing him as one of the actors capable of carrying the biggest stories in American cinema. Roles grew increasingly important, films received bigger budgets, and his name started appearing prominently on movie posters. To many on the outside, it was the perfect dream. A boy who once grew up on the violent streets of Mount Vernon was now standing at the pinnacle of Hollywood. But for Denzel himself, this change brought a feeling that few outsiders could understand. Fame is like an extremely bright spotlight. It illuminates every success, every victory, but at the same time makes it impossible to escape the world's gaze. After Malcolm X, people began looking at Denzel Washington as a standard. Every role of his was no longer just a movie, it became an event. Audiences waited for him to continue delivering great performances. Critics waited to analyze every detail of his acting. And Hollywood expected him to always maintain his position as a top star. That pressure didn't come loudly. It crept into every workday, every interview, every moment he stepped onto set. Because when you become an icon, mistakes are no longer seen as ordinary mistakes. They become a disappointment to an entire industry. Along with the pressure came another feeling: loneliness. Before fame, Denzel could walk down the street without anyone noticing. He could sit in a coffee shop, observing the world around him, listening to the stories of ordinary people. But when he became one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces, that life gradually disappeared. Simple walks became difficult. Casual conversations were sometimes replaced by curious stares and photo requests. Denzel once said that fame can make a person feel like they're living in a room full of people yet completely alone. Because when people look at you as an icon, they rarely see the real human being. Hollywood has long been seen as the land of dreams, a place where talents can turn their lives into legendary stories. But after standing long enough in that world, Denzel began to realize that the dream also has a dark side. It's a place where success can disorient a person if they aren't strong enough. Lavish parties, non-stop praise, enormous money-making opportunities, all of it can become dangerous temptations. He had seen many talented actors around him get swept into the whirlwind of fame and gradually lose themselves. Some drowned in drugs. Others were swallowed by arrogance and wrong decisions. Those stories aren't rare in Hollywood. And Denzel understood that no one is immune to those temptations. For him, the most frightening thing wasn't failure on screen, but the risk of losing himself. In the years after Malcolm X, he began thinking more about the path he was on. Success can bring money, fame, and recognition, but it can also become an invisible trap. If a person starts believing that the spotlight is the entire value of their life. Denzel Washington didn't want to become one of the sad stories Hollywood so often produces, but even with all his discipline and willpower, he still had to face inner battles that audiences would never see. Because sometimes the greatest challenges don't come from outside. They come from within ourselves. And in the years at the height of fame, Denzel Washington began to realize that the hardest battle of his life wasn't any role on screen. It was the battle with himself, a silent battle that stretched over many years, and one that could destroy everything if he didn't find a way to win. And in that battle, the most dangerous enemy wasn't Hollywood. It was temptation, the thing that had brought down so many stars before him. The spotlight of fame can make everything look dazzling from the outside, but inside it is sometimes a silent battle that very few people see. After years of becoming one of the most powerful faces in Hollywood, Denzel Washington began facing a reality that many stars before him had also experienced. The pressure of fame wasn't just in the work, but also in the quiet moments of private life. After premieres, after interviews, after the film crew left the set and the lights gradually dimmed, there was still a man left to face himself. In those years, Denzel began drinking alcohol more, not in the loud way of Hollywood parties, not to celebrate victories or flaunt success. He drank in silence. Sometimes a glass at the end of a long day, sometimes a few glasses when night had fallen and the city grew quiet. And gradually, those drinks became a habit. At first, it felt like a way to ease the pressure, a way to temporarily turn off the noise of the world around him. When a person lives under the gaze of millions of viewers, silence sometimes becomes the hardest thing to find. Alcohol brought a temporary feeling that everything was slowing down. Worries about work, Hollywood's expectations, questions about the next role, all of it seemed to fade into the background for a few short hours. But behind that quiet was a truth Denzel didn't want to face yet. He wasn't drinking to celebrate life. He was drinking to escape the emptiness in his life. The following years passed, and the habit continued. On the outside, his career kept moving forward. He starred in major films, earned respect from audiences and colleagues, and became one of the highest-paid actors in the industry. But in his private life, there were nights when alcohol became the most familiar companion. No one on the red carpet saw it. No one in the articles praising his career mentioned it, but for Denzel, it was part of the battle he had to face. He later admitted that his drinking habit lasted for many years. It wasn't the chaotic scenes often seen in Hollywood stories. There were no loud scandals or nights of losing control in front of cameras. But it was precisely that silence that made it dangerous, because when someone can keep everything looking normal from the outside, they can also easily convince themselves that there's no problem at all. And for a long time, Denzel Washington did exactly that. But deep down, he began to recognize a hard-to-accept truth. Alcohol didn't really help him escape the pressure. It only made those problems temporarily silent. And when the silence passed, everything was still there. Sometimes even heavier. Mornings waking up with exhaustion. Long nights when the mind couldn't rest. moments when he wondered if he was going too far down a path he once thought was harmless. Denzel Washington has always been a man of discipline. From his days at military school to the years of training to become an actor, he had learned how to control himself. But even with all that willpower, he wasn't immune to life's temptations. And that very awareness began to worry him. Because he had seen what happened to others in Hollywood, he had seen great talents swallowed by habits that seemed harmless. He had seen brilliant careers collapse because of repeated wrong choices. There was a moment, many years after the drinking habit began, when Denzel had to face a truth he could no longer ignore. He realized that if he continued like this, alcohol could gradually take away the most important things in his life. Not just his health, not just his career, but the peace of his soul and his relationships with the people he loved. That was a painful realization, because it forced him to admit that the biggest battle of his life wasn't with Hollywood, wasn't with the pressure of fame, but with himself. But sometimes, those very moments of recognizing the truth open the path to change. And for Denzel Washington, that path didn't lead him to glamorous solutions or easy promises. It led him back to a very familiar place from his childhood, where prayers once rang out every evening in the small house in Mount Vernon, because in the years of facing temptation and loneliness, Denzel began to feel that something was calling him back to the faith he had been taught as a boy, and it was there, in a moment he would never forget, that Denzel Washington's life began to change once again. After many years of silently battling the pressure of fame and the temptations few people see, Denzel Washington's life began to turn in a different direction. In a moment he himself couldn't fully explain with reason. It wasn't a big premiere. It wasn't a great role. It wasn't a film award. The biggest turning point of his life happened in a very simple space, a church service. After years of being busy with work and Hollywood's pressures, Denzel began to feel there was an emptiness in his soul that fame couldn't fill. He had achieved almost everything an actor could dream of. But deep down, he still felt like part of himself was lost. And during a church service, amid hymns and prayers, he began to sense something he hadn't experienced in many years. It wasn't a clear sound. It wasn't a specific voice, but a very powerful feeling, as if something was calling him back. That feeling made him remember his childhood, remembering the evenings in the small house in Mount Vernon when his father, Denzel Hayes Washington Sr., read the Bible and spoke of faith as the foundation of life, remembering the prayers his mother taught him when he was a boy. For many years, amid the whirlwind of Hollywood, those memories had gradually become distant. But in that moment, they all came rushing back at once. Denzel began to feel that his life wasn't just a series of films and awards. There was something greater waiting for him to recognize. For many people, a spiritual awakening moment isn't a noisy event. It comes quietly, like light slowly appearing after a long night. For Denzel Washington, that church service was like a mirror reflecting his life. In that mirror, he saw not only the successes, but also the mistakes, the fears, and the habits he knew he needed to change. He realized that if he wanted to keep moving forward, he had to reclaim what had once kept his family strong when he was young: faith. After that moment, Denzel began returning to his spiritual life. He read the Bible more often. He prayed more. And most importantly, he began rethinking the purpose of his life. He no longer saw his film career just as a journey to achieve fame. He started viewing it as an opportunity to tell meaningful stories, stories that could touch other people's hearts. That wasn't a change that happened overnight, but step by step, he felt he was regaining the balance he had lost. Denzel Washington later spoke many times about this period as one of the most important turning points in his life. He didn't talk about it like a miracle. He talked about it like an awakening, a moment when he understood that a person cannot live on external success alone. There are deeper things that need to be nurtured within the soul. And for him, that was faith. In a later interview, looking back on his journey, he said a simple but powerful sentence: "Without God, I would not be here today." That statement wasn't a slogan. It was an acknowledgement that there were times in his life when he felt he could lose everything if he didn't find the right direction again. Faith didn't make his life easier, but it gave him a solid foundation to stand up every time he felt lost. It reminded him that a person's worth doesn't lie in the number of awards they receive, but in the way they live their life. For Denzel Washington, that evening in church wasn't just a personal moment. It became a lifelong reminder that true success isn't standing at the peak of Hollywood. True success is keeping your soul intact amid all the temptations of the world. And from that moment on, he began looking at his life with different eyes. Not as a star trying to hold on to his position, but as a human being trying to live true to the purpose he believed he had been given. But in that journey, there was one thing that had always been by his side for a very long time, quietly helping him stand firm through every storm of fame. It wasn't Hollywood. It wasn't awards. It was family, especially the woman who had walked with him for more than 4 decades, even through the hardest years. But if there was one thing that helped Denzel Washington stay grounded through all the turbulent years of fame, it wasn't just faith. It was also family, and especially the woman who stood by his side through nearly his entire journey, Pauletta Washington. The two first met in the late 1970s on the set of the television movie Wilma. At that time, Denzel was still a young, unknown actor, while Pauletta was a talented actress and singer. There were no bright Hollywood lights surrounding them then, no red carpets, no articles about their private lives. Just two young people trying to find their way in the world of art. But right from those early days, a special bond formed between them. In 1983, they got married. Back then, no one could have known that their marriage would last more than 4 decades in an industry famous for short-lived relationships. The early years of their marriage happened before Denzel became one of Hollywood's biggest stars. They were simpler times when the two were still building their life step by step. But as Denzel's career exploded, especially after the major films and prestigious awards, their family life entered a completely different kind of challenge. Hollywood has its own way of testing relationships. Packed work schedules force couples to be apart for months. Rumors in the press can appear at any time, and the public's eyes always watch every tiniest detail of private life. Denzel and Pauletta's marriage wasn't immune to those pressures. There were years when his work made time for family scarce. Long filming trips, promotional tours, travels around the world, all of it pulled him away from the home where his family was waiting. For Pauletta, that wasn't always easy. Like many wives of famous men, she had to learn to live in a world where her husband always belonged to the spotlight. And like every marriage, they had difficult periods. Press rumors sometimes put their private life under scrutiny. There were times when silence became the only way to protect their family from stories they didn't want to answer in public. But what made their story different from many other Hollywood marriages was that they didn't leave each other when things got tough. Instead of letting outside pressures break their family, they chose to return to what had bound them from the beginning: respect, patience, and trust. There was one particularly special moment in their marriage that Denzel once shared with rare sincerity. After many years together, the two decided to renew their wedding vows in a private ceremony. It wasn't a glamorous event for the press. It wasn't a ceremony held for attention. It was a reminder between two people that their love remained intact after all the challenges life had brought. For more than 40 years, Denzel and Pauletta built a family with 4 children. They watched each other grow, change, and overcome the difficult phases of life. While Hollywood often tells stories of broken marriages, their relationship became something rare: a testament that love can survive even in a world full of temptations and pressures. Denzel has said many times that he couldn't have achieved his career successes without the stability his family provided. Because after all the films, awards, and applause, there was still a place he could return to, where he wasn't a movie star, but just a husband and a father. Perhaps that's why, when talking about his life, Denzel Washington rarely mentions Hollywood first. He talks about faith. He talks about faith. And especially, he talks about the woman who never left him even in the hardest times. In an industry where many relationships last only a few years, their story is like a quiet miracle. But even as family life gave Denzel the balance he needed, his journey in Hollywood was far from over. In fact, in the years that followed, he would become more than just a movie star. He would become a trailblazer for an entire new generation of artists, those who looked at him and believed they too could step into Hollywood and change history. After more than 4 decades standing firm under the Hollywood lights, Denzel Washington is no longer just seen as a great movie star. He has become an icon, a trailblazer for the generations of actors who came after him. In the early years of his career, Hollywood was still a place where major opportunities for black actors were extremely limited. Complex roles, central characters in big stories were rarely given to them. But through persistence, talent, and relentless discipline, Denzel Washington gradually broke through those barriers. His roles in major films were not just personal successes. They became proof that audiences around the world were ready to embrace stories told by black artists with the same depth and power as anyone else. And as his position in Hollywood grew more solid, Denzel began to understand that his responsibility didn't stop at continuing to play big roles. He realized that the doors he had opened shouldn't be closed behind him. Instead, he wanted to keep them wide open so that younger people could step through. For many years, he quietly supported, encouraged, and inspired young actors trying to find their footing in the film industry. One of the most famous stories related to his influence is with Chadwick Boseman. When Boseman was still a young student at Howard University, he received a special scholarship to join an acting training program in England. What Boseman didn't know at the time was that the person who quietly funded that scholarship was Denzel Washington. Many years later, when Boseman had become a global star with his role in Black Panther, he publicly said that he wouldn't have had that opportunity without Denzel's support. For Boseman, Denzel Washington wasn't just a legendary actor. He was the one who opened the first door to his dream. Denzel's influence also spread to other young artists, like Michael B. Jordan, who later became one of the most prominent faces of the new generation in Hollywood. Jordan has said many times that Denzel Washington's roles were the biggest inspiration when he first pursued acting. For many young actors, seeing Denzel on screen wasn't just watching a movie. It was seeing their own potential in the future. He proved that a black actor didn't have to limit themselves to small or stereotypical roles. They could play leaders, heroes, complex characters, carrying the full depth of history and humanity. But what makes Denzel Washington a true trailblazer isn't just the opportunities he helped create for others. It lies in the way he lives and works. Young actors entering the film industry are often overwhelmed by Hollywood's glamour. But when they look at Denzel, they see a different role model. A man who always arrives on set on time. A man who prepares for every role with near absolute seriousness. A man who believes talent only truly matters when paired with discipline and humility. In many interviews, Denzel often reminds young actors that success isn't something achieved just through fame. It has to be built day by day, through hard work and honesty with the craft. So in the eyes of many in the film industry, Denzel Washington isn't just a big star. He is a spiritual leader, a man who walked through the barriers of history to open a wider path for those who came after. When young actors look at his journey, they don't just see a successful career. They see a map, a path that proves seemingly impossible. Dreams can still become reality if a person is brave enough to walk it. And that is perhaps the greatest legacy Denzel Washington is leaving for Hollywood, not just the great films, but the doors that have been opened so that future generations of artists can step through and write their own stories. But as time passes and new generations begin to continue that journey, a big question gradually emerges. After all the successes, challenges, and inner battles, how is the man behind it all living his life today, as he reaches the age of 71? Time passes faster than anyone can realize. The angry youthful years of the boy in Mount Vernon now feel very far behind. At the age of 71, Denzel Washington is no longer the young actor trying to prove himself to Hollywood. He has become part of film history. For more than 4 decades, he has delivered roles that changed the way audiences view the art of acting, from films like Glory to Training Day and Malcolm X. But what surprises many people is that even after reaching a peak few actors can touch, Denzel Washington hasn't stopped. At an age when many choose to retire, he continues working with the same discipline that has followed him his entire life. He keeps making films, keeps appearing in front of the camera with the familiar power that still makes audiences fall silent when he speaks. Not stopping at acting, he has also moved into directing, telling stories he believes need to be told. Theater projects and films rich with human depth continue to appear in his career, as if Denzel Washington is still pursuing the same question he carried from his days as a lost college student: how to tell meaningful stories. In the world of Hollywood, success is often measured by money and fame, and by that measure, Denzel Washington has clearly achieved more than most. With dozens of successful films and a career spanning more than 40 years, his net worth is estimated at over $300 million. Those numbers are enough to overwhelm anyone, but for Denzel, money has never defined his life. He once said that if a person chases only money, they may achieve wealth but still feel empty. After all the years working in the film industry, he understands that the true value of a life isn't in the numbers in a bank account. It lies in the people standing beside you when the stage lights go out. And for Denzel Washington, what he is most proud of isn't the Oscars or the legendary roles. It is his family. More than 40 years after their wedding, he and Pauletta Washington are still together. In an industry where marriages often crumble under the weight of fame, their story has become something rare. They raised 4 children together, watched them grow up and find their own paths in life. One of them, John David Washington, has even stepped into the film industry and begun building his own career. But for Denzel, what matters isn't whether his children become stars or not. What matters is that they grew up with the values he and Pauletta tried to pass on: discipline, faith, and respect for others. When looking back on his life at the age of 71, Denzel Washington doesn't see a string of perfect victories. He sees a journey full of twists and turns, from an angry boy in a broken family to a lost young man in his college years, to a young actor rejected time after time in Hollywood. He sees the years of battling the pressures of fame, the temptations that could have destroyed his life, and the moments when he had to turn back to faith to find his way again. All of that has shaped the man he is today, and perhaps that's why, when standing before audiences or young students chasing their dreams, Denzel Washington often says something very simple: success is not the final destination. What matters is how you live your life on the road to get there. At the age of 71, Denzel Washington continues to do what he has done for more than 40 years: tell stories. But now, those stories are not just roles on screen. They are the lessons he leaves for the next generation, lessons about discipline, about faith, about perseverance in the face of failure, and about keeping your soul intact in a world that always tries to pull you in different directions. And as that long journey gradually approaches its final chapter, the legacy Denzel Washington leaves is not only in the films audiences will re-watch for years to come. It lies in the question his life poses to all of us. After everything you achieve, what truly remains when the last light goes out? But as the stage lights slowly dim and the story of Denzel Washington's life moves toward its final chapters, what remains is not just the great roles or the prolonged applause. What remains is the question about the man behind it all. Because Denzel Washington has never been a perfect person, his life has not been a straight line from poverty to glory. It has been a journey full of twists, mistakes, and inner battles that even he had to take many years to overcome. He was once an angry boy after his family broke apart. He was once a lost young man in his college years, not knowing who he wanted to become. He was once a young actor rejected over and over when Hollywood's doors seemed unwilling to open. And even when standing at the peak of fame, he still had to face temptations that could destroy anyone. Hollywood stories are often told like dazzling legends, but if you look deeply into Denzel Washington's life, what makes him special is not the moments of triumph. It is the way he got back up after moments of weakness. There were times when he had to face himself and admit that fame could not bring meaning to life without a solid foundation. There were nights when he realized that what the world called success could still leave a person feeling empty if they didn't know what they were living for. And it was in those moments that Denzel Washington made the most important choices of his life. He chose to return to the faith his parents taught him from childhood. He chose to keep his family at the center of his life, even when Hollywood kept trying to pull him in other directions. He chose to live with discipline and humility, even after reaching a position many see as the peak of success. And most importantly, he chose to live with a clear purpose. That talent and fame only truly matter when used to create something greater than oneself. Over more than 40 years, Denzel Washington has played many different characters on screen. He has been a soldier, a cop, a lawyer, a leader, even characters full of darkness and conflict. But when looking back on that entire journey, the most important role of his was not any character in his famous films. The most important role of his was the real life he chose to live. A life that is not perfect but full of meaning. A life that shows a person can get lost, can stumble, but can still find the right path if they are brave enough to change. For many young people chasing their dreams, Denzel Washington's story is not just about success in Hollywood. It is a reminder that every person must face important choices. You can chase fame, you can chase power, you can try to accumulate money and glory. But in the end, those things are not what determine the value of a life. The value of a life lies in what you live for, and what you leave behind for the world after you are gone. When looking at Denzel Washington's journey, we see a man who walked many paths before finding his true purpose. And perhaps that is the greatest message his story leaves behind. Not everyone finds their life's purpose right from the start. Sometimes you have to go through years of feeling lost. Sometimes you have to face temptations and mistakes. But if you keep moving forward, if you keep searching for what truly matters, you can find your path. Because in the end, Denzel Washington's life can be summed up in one very simple truth. Some men chase fame, some chase power. Denzel Washington chased purpose. The story of Denzel Washington's life makes people not only admire him, but also feel a deep pang of sorrow when looking back on the entire journey he walked. Behind the image of a two-time Oscar winner, with immortal roles in Glory, Malcolm X, and Training Day, is a man who once stood very close to the edge of a completely different life. His childhood shattered when his parents divorced at just 14 years old, and he himself has admitted that if his mother hadn't sent him to military school, he might have ended up like many of his childhood friends, those who later got shot or went to prison. That makes his story even more heartbreaking, because it shows how the distance between a legend and a tragedy can sometimes be just one small decision in life. Later on, even after reaching the peak of fame, he still had to battle inner emptiness when alcohol became his way to escape the pressures and loneliness of Hollywood. But what makes Denzel Washington truly admirable is not that he never fell, but the way he got back up. He returned to faith, preserved his more than 40-year marriage with Pauletta Washington, and even paved the way for a new generation of black actors like Chadwick Boseman. For the people of the United States, his story is a powerful reminder that the American dream is not a straight road to success, but a journey of making the right choices amid temptations and failures. The greatest lesson from Denzel Washington's life is perhaps what he has proven with his own existence. Success is not about how famous you become, but about having the strength to hold on to your values when the world around you tries to pull you down a different path. If the story of Denzel Washington's challenging yet extraordinary journey makes you reflect, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the real stories behind the legends who changed Hollywood. Thank you for staying until the end of the video, and see you in the next story where we will dive deeper into the life of another figure who overcame adversity to write their own legacy.